And there we go. Well, welcome, Max.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks, Kathleen and Mill City Quakers, and wonderful to see some familiar faces and look forward to meeting others. Delighted that Rousey, Hobson, and Kay Coltrane can be on this session because they know a lot about the history of what we'll be talking about today, the Quaker anti-slavery movement, its impact in North Carolina. Kay has written the history of Center Friends meeting, which will be today. And Rousey is very much involved in the Quakers United in Publishing, which has published some of the books, I think, that we'll be mentioning today and others. So I look forward to their chiming in. And David, I know, knows a lot of this history as well. So I welcome their insights and contributions, questions, and corrections. The first two sessions that we've had have covered the origins of the Quaker community here in North Carolina. And I'll just mention briefly, and we'll mention a little bit later on, that I just spent the last weekend back in those sites of Perquimans and Pasquotank County, visiting where Edmondson and Fox slogged through the Great Dismal in 1672, and appropriate to today's topic, visiting some of the sites associated with the beginnings of the anti-slavery movement here. So anyway, today's topic is about the anti-slavery movement and the origins of the Underground Railroad here in North Carolina, and some of the stories associated with that. To start off with, and again, I'll mention this in connection with my trip out to Pasquotank and Perquimans last weekend. I went out there to speak to the Perquimans County Restoration Association, which seeks to preserve some of that early history in Perquimans, not just Quaker, but other early history. And one of the buildings that they are most famous for preserving is the 1730 Newbold White House, Flemish bond, lovely house on the banks of the Perquimans River, built by Abraham Saunders, a Quaker. And they were mentioning to me that in the inventory of his possessions upon his death were two enslaved persons, Bess and two disabled blacks that they didn't have the names for. And they asked me, we usually connect Quakers with the Underground Railroad and anti-slavery. How is it that in 1730, Quakers owned slaves? And went into a bit of the description that I'm just about to enter into now. Indeed, early Quakers did own slaves. They were enslavers. George Fox does not condemn slavery, but urged Quakers to treat their enslaved persons well and provide for their religious instruction and education. William Penn, as we know, because of current controversies, was an enslaver of number of enslaved persons to help build Pennsbury Manor, his mansion home up the Delaware River from Philadelphia. You're probably aware that because of that fact and the current issues around that history, William Penn's name is being removed from a few institutions. William Penn House in D.C., the William Penn Room at a friend's house in London. I think his statue on top of City Hall in Philadelphia is safe because it's a little too high up there for people to get to. But it is an issue, and it does remind us that it took Quakers more than a century to come to a testimony of anti-slavery, and even that did not necessarily keep Quakers from involvement in slavery, as we'll share a bit later. The beginnings of the movement towards Quakers adopting an anti-slavery testimony by the 1770s can be tracked back typically to 1688 and the Germantown Remonstrance. That's something you can look up on the internet, the Germantown Remonstrance. In 1688, four Quakers in Germantown who had been Mennonites in the Netherlands wound up in the Palatinate of Germany in the 1670s to escape persecution. And when William Penn, George Fox, George Keith, and Robert Barclay made a missionary trip through the Palatinate in the late 1670s, convinced a number of those Anabaptists to become Quakers. And in 1683, a boatload of them on the Concord, without the E on the end, sailed into Philadelphia and traveled a bit north and settled Germantown, now a neighborhood of Philadelphia. As refugees from spiritual malpractice in Europe, they were shocked to find that Quakers in the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania were enslavers. And these four Quakers, two of whom were Updegraffs, ancestors of David B. Updegraff, the great Quaker schismatic of Ohio in the post-Civil War period, signed this document. It was based on the Golden Rule. It just started out with, would any of us want to be enslaved? No. Then why would we enslave others? And goes on to protest the practice of Quakers' involvement with slavery. Well, as you know, Quaker polity is such that you have to achieve unity to make decisions or to change practice. So this protest, this remonstrance, went to the monthly meeting. A monthly meeting found it too grave a concern to reach unity. And of course, that was based on the fact that at the time, Quakers in the Philadelphia area owned other persons at a higher rate than anyone else because they were among the first there. They had the wealth, and they enslaved others at a higher rate than others. So it was an economic interest. Slavery was an economic engine, and Quakers were loath to give up their advantage. So it got kicked up the road to quarterly meeting. Quarterly meeting found it too grave a concern to reach unity, so they kicked it up to a yearly meeting. And for decades, this matter came before Friends to the yearly meeting level, and they could not find unity. Again, in large part because there was such advantage economically to owning others. At the time, an enslaved person was worth over $1,000 if they were a young, workable person or childbearing. So it was a major investment. Well, the Germantown remonstrance didn't get much traction. George Keith, a few years later, 5 years later, in 1693, again, he was one of the four Quakers who had convinced those Germans to come over as Quakers, wrote a treatise opposing slavery. And if you know much about George Keith, he had been a convinced friend who traveled with those worthies, Penn and Barclay and Fox, and later protested not only slavery, but Quakerism. He was of the opinion that Quakers weren't Christian enough. And eventually he seceded from the Society of Friends and formed an alternative group called the Christian Quakers, or the Keithian Quakers, that lasted for a bit before he left and rejoined the Church of England. And as I mentioned in that first session of ours, he was among the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge Anglican missionaries who came back to the colonies to try to convince Quakers out of their heathenism and back into the true church. So Keith is a whole other story that'd be worth a whole session. Well, there were these protests, but again, no traction yet. The next major figure in the developing protest against Quaker slavery by Quakers that I want to mention is Benjamin Lay. Many of you probably are familiar with Benjamin Lay. And I sent Kathleen the name of a book that I hope, if you haven't read, you'll have opportunity to. Marcus Rediker's The Fearless Benjamin Lay, the Quaker dwarf who essentially jump-started the North Atlantic abolitionist movement. The dwarf who became the first revolutionary abolitionist. Marcus Rediker is an historian at the University of Pittsburgh. And when he published this book a few years ago about Benjamin Lay, it jump-started quite an interesting movement among Quakers to reinstate him. Benjamin Lay, as I'll mention later, was disowned by every meeting he ever belonged to because of his eccentricities. But after this book came out, he has been posthumously reinstated to all those Friends meetings. But in a review in the New York Times review of books, the headline for the review of Marcus Rediker's book about Benjamin Lay was, "You will never be more radical than this dwarf Quaker." Well, Benjamin Lay had been a sailor for about 17 years, so had witnessed the worst of the Middle Passage, the worst of the Caribbean slave plantations, and became an avid abolitionist. And in the 1720s and 30s, came to live north of Philadelphia in the Abington area. The description of it is he lived in a cave. Now, I've seen varying descriptions. There is a cave marked as Benjamin Lay's Cave near Abington Friends Meeting House. But I've also read that he had a cottage built into the hill, so it looked like he lived in a hobbit house cave. But for whatever reason, whether it was a little cottage built into a hill or a cave, he lived very simply, very eccentrically, vegetarian, 4 foot tall, hunchback dwarf, and very, very opposed to slavery. He too, tried to witness to Friends and get them to come to the truth of the anti-slavery movement, but couldn't gain any traction. So he started engaging in guerrilla theater. Some interesting tactics. One would be to stand with one shoe on, one shoe off in the snow outside of Quaker gatherings in Philadelphia. And when people would come out and express sympathy for him being shoeless in the snow, he would say, "Oh, I can go home and get a shoe on. You know who can't?" And would describe the conditions that enslaved persons lived in. Another occasion, somewhat controversial, he kidnapped the children of some leading Quakers in Philadelphia yearly meeting and held them for several hours while their parents desperately searched for them. And when he returned them, he said, "How did that feel? You know who gets kidnapped all the time and don't come back to their parents?" Well, again, none of these actions gained any traction either. Just further enraged Friends and led to his disownment from meetings. His most famous guerrilla theater that many of you are aware of was after he had presented his petition for Friends to end their involvement with slavery, and it was tabled once again. He left the meeting, came back a while later with his gray Quaker overcoat concealing a military uniform. As he strode to the front of the room, he tossed off his overcoat, revealing this military uniform and a sword in a scabbard by his side, and holding a Bible in the crook of his arm. He pulled out the sword, plunged it into the Bible, which he had previously hollowed out and filled with a pig's bladder full of red berry juice. And as he yelled out, "Not to end slavery is like plunging a sword through the very heart of the gospel," the punctured bladder spread all that blood over the proper Quakers sitting there. He was tossed out, of course. But all that drama and his appeals to Friends' consciences about slavery still did not lead to an anti-slavery adoption by Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. But it did kick the door in, I believe, for later Friends with gentler tactics to move friends towards anti-slavery. Among those that came through that door were the more familiar John Woolman. I won't have to go into all of John Woolman's history as a Quaker saint. Most people still venerate him, although we don't have any locks of his hair or knuckles. But folk are familiar with his journal, his plea for the poor, and the reasons he was opposed to slavery. And his tactics were different from Lay's. For one, he published some considerations on the keeping of Negroes, essays that he published at his own expense because there wasn't unity in Philadelphia yearly meeting to publish these. So he published them at his own expense. And by the 1750s, Philadelphia yearly meeting was moving in that right direction, forbidding the buying and selling and importation of enslaved persons, but hadn't gotten to the point yet of banning involvement with slavery. Of course, Woolman's trip to North Carolina in 1757 was to individually confront Quaker slave owners with the sin of their involvement in the peculiar institution. And it was a remarkable trip for many reasons. One was he walked from Mount Holly down to North Carolina because he didn't want to abuse the horses and the stage hands, but also because of his tactic. He didn't go to Quaker slave owners and their plantations, wag his finger in their faces and yell at them. Essentially, as Vernie Davis, formerly a professor of peace studies here at Guilford College, has written in some of his essays about John Woolman, said, we have a problem. We, as a society of friends, have a problem with our involvement with slavery. It wasn't you have a problem, it's we have a problem. The problem is this is not only abusing the enslaved persons, but this threatens your own soul and those of your own children, because we are involved in the misapplication of power. We are abusing the power we have over others, and we could use it for good or we could use it for ill, and we are using it in a misapplied, inconsistent way with our Christian profession. And not only did he couch it in those terms, he also exemplified his opposition to slavery when he came to these homes, and they, as being good Quakers and good Southerners, offered him some sweet tea or whatever, would refuse if the hospitality was offered on the backs of slave labor. He said, well, who prepared the drink? And if it was enslaved person, he said, well, I'm sorry, I can't, or he would pay for it. Well, if you can't drink, at least go upstairs. You've walked a long way. You must be tired. Get some rest. Well, who made the bed? And if he was told it was enslaved labor, he would refuse, or he would pay for the hospitality, or quite often he would go out to slave quarters and stay there and eat with the enslaved persons. And that example, along with his reputation as a humble minister of friends, convinced many that if they couldn't offer hospitality to such as a John Woolman, they had to get out of this business. And it was quite effective in leading many friends who were enslavers themselves to give up their involvement. Another figure who was having quite an impact at the time is less well known, but this is Anthony Benezet. And if you're not familiar with Anthony Benezet, I'd encourage you to look him up. I think Kathleen can post a book by Irv Brindlinger, George Fox University professor, who wrote a book about Anthony Benezet. To remain silent would be criminal. Now, Anthony Benezet was born in 1713 to a Huguenot family in France. And they barely escaped with their lives, losing all of their earthly possessions 2 years later when persecution of Protestants increased, and got to Holland, eventually to England, where most of the Benezet family became Moravian, but Anthony became Quaker. Wound up in Philadelphia in the 1730s, where he opened the first Negro school in North America. One story I've read is that one of his students in that Negro school was Richard Allen, who went on to found the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But Anthony Benezet, because he too had been a pilgrim and a stranger in this land as a refugee, had a deep sensitivity to the sin of slavery. And where John Woolman was effective within the Society of Friends, Benezet had more impact outside the Society of Friends in publishing works that led to, in fact, the establishment of the North Atlantic abolitionist movement. His writings, especially some historical account of Guinea, caught the attention of John and Charles Wesley, who were anti-slavery Methodists, who in turn influenced William Savery and the abolitionist movement in England and led directly to the 1808 abolition in England of slavery. All traces back to Anthony Benezet. And Benezet's some historical account of Guinea addressed two of the main arguments that people are using to justify slavery, even as Christians. One was, it's so awful in Africa, we're doing these people a great service by getting them out of Africa and bringing them to civilized America. And in his account of Guinea, as an amateur anthropologist, he described the culture and conditions in Africa before colonial activity, before the slave trade, and portrayed it as, it wasn't as bad as you think. And secondly, he addressed the question of the argument that we are bringing these heathens out of Africa and Christianizing them. What a benefit. They may have to suffer in this life, but saving them, converting them to Christianity will assure their eternal life. And Benezet's argument was, okay, if that's your reason, the great, great gift of giving them Christianity, why aren't you freeing them after they've become Christians? And so again, he exposes the reality of the real reasons. As Woolman also pointed, this is about creating wealth on the back of oppressed labor. So bit by bit, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting adopts opposition to slavery, first by refusing importation, buying and selling, and finally in 1776, interestingly enough, adopts a testimony against the involvement of slavery by anyone who's a member of the Society of Friends. Followed 2 years later, as the mother church's decisions ripple out to other yearly meetings, in 1778, North Carolina Yearly Meeting adopts an anti-slavery testimony. Now, last weekend, when I was visiting in Perquimans and Pasquotank, I got a chance to visit the home, or at least see the home, of Thomas Newby, who in, I think it was 1772, helped jumpstart North Carolina Yearly Meeting's eventual adoption of an anti-slavery testimony. Of course, Woolman had come down to Perquimans and Pasquotank counties in 1757. In his journal, he talks about visiting with newbies, and clearly this had an impact. And Thomas Newby, an enslaver whose home still stands, was a plantation home of Belvedere, which gives its name to the neighboring town of, little Quaker town of Belvedere, went to his monthly meeting saying, I can't any longer in good conscience own slaves. What do I do? The problem was, in North Carolina, there was a law against manumitting your enslaved persons. They didn't want a bunch of free blacks hanging around. They were worried about slave revolts and all of that. And there's the home of Thomas Newby, Belvedere, still standing. Interesting, not only for its association with the beginnings of anti-slavery in North Carolina, but also because in that home, in 1995, the great rock and roll DJ Wolfman Jack dropped dead of a massive heart attack and is buried next door in the family plot. He married a descendant of Thomas Newby. So monthly meeting, of course, wrestles with this, goes to yearly meeting, and by the time Philadelphia has adopted anti-slavery, it's time for North Carolina. In 1778, North Carolina yearly meeting adopts an anti-slavery testimony. That didn't mean that every Quaker hopped on board. When I was there this weekend, Lynn Winslow, one of the many, many Winslows out of that area, took us on a tour and showed us the site of where one of his ancestors, Nathan Winslow, had his farm. When North Carolina yearly meeting adopted the anti-slavery testimony, Nathan Winslow said, "That's all well and good. I ain't giving up my enslaved persons." So he was disowned. But as you know, disownment among Quakers isn't like Amish shunning. He continued to go to worship, still associated with friends, but just wasn't welcome to business meetings and publicly was disowned as representing friends, but continued to own other persons up until the Civil War. And one of his enslaved persons was Cromwell Winslow, who after the Civil War was given a tract of land by Nathan Winslow that he later on farmed. Lynn showed us the site where that house used to be. So there were those friends who were disowned, but continued to associate with friends and continued to own enslaved persons. There was one a bit more notorious. We don't know exactly whether John Armfield, born into a Quaker family here in Guilford County, his family left friends even before he was born, but had been Quaker up until then in the 1770s, 1780s. We don't know whether they left friends because of their involvement in the Revolutionary War or because they wanted to continue to own their enslaved persons. But John Armfield, born in the 1790s, just a few years ahead of Levi Coffin, whom we'll talk about a bit later, went on to be the largest slave trader in American history. With Isaac Franklin, he formed the slave company of Franklin and Armfield with offices in Alexandria, Virginia. And they were dealing in thousands of persons annually. John Armfield became one of the wealthiest people in America and used some of his wealth to endow the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. So if any of you are alumni of the University of the South, a fine Episcopal school, you've got that to deal with. So there was not a uniform Quaker salute to the anti-slavery movement, but officially, North Carolina yearly meeting adopted anti-slavery. And then Quakers who had previously owned other persons had to deal with how to deal with their enslaved persons.
Hey, Max.
Persons to the yearly meeting for the purpose of their holding these enslaved persons as free Negroes. They were known as Quaker free Negroes. At one time, North Carolina yearly meeting was the largest slave owner in North Carolina, holding title to estimated between 800 and 1,000 of these Quaker free Negroes. If they were kidnapped, they could go to court and show that they were in fact owned by the yearly meeting. Well, legislatures can figure that kind of stuff out, and so that was not a long-term solution. Some friends became involved in the colonization societies, finding those who were willing to go back to Africa or down to Haiti and to the Caribbean. George Swain whom we'll mention later on, was one of those, president of the Guilford County Colonization Society. But that didn't work well because, again, conditions back there weren't great, and they could easily be re-enslaved. And there were unscrupulous sea captains who sometimes took these cargoes and sold them back into slavery. Where Center Friends meeting, Kay Coltrane's meeting, figures into this. In 1815, I believe it was, the state's first manumission society was founded by Quakers and a few others. I think there are Osborns involved, Vestal Coffin. There's an historical marker in front of Center Friends meeting about the foundation of that first manumission society, a society that tried to convince people to manumit their enslaved persons. Again, very little of this worked because of the massive slave culture here and the economic advantage of slavery. So there wasn't much traction, again, in ending slavery here in the state, although Friends had adopted it themselves. Now, one of the problems that these Quaker free Negroes faced and other free blacks faced was the problem of kidnapping. And this was one of the things that led directly to the beginnings of the Underground Railroad in North Carolina. And one of the most famous of these cases was in 1817. Benjamin Benson was a free black living up in Delaware. He was kidnapped and sold into slavery to John Thompson, not the basketball coach, but another John Thompson, who was a merchant here in Greensboro. Well, Benjamin Benson knew his rights. He knew that he was legally free and had the papers to prove it. So he went to court in Greensboro to sue for his freedom. And three Quakers from the New Garden meeting, avid abolitionists themselves, Vestal Coffin, one of the founders of the Manumission Society, you'll recognize the Coffin name from Nantucket, Enoch Macy, you might recognize the Macy name from up there in New England, and George Swain, another Nantucket name, learned about Benjamin Benson's case and went to bat for him. Now, they were known abolitionists. They were known for their petitions to the legislature, for their involvement in the Manumission Society. So John Thompson got spooked. And Thompson, to protect his investment, sold Benjamin Benson to an enslaver in Georgia. And off went Benjamin Benson to Georgia, followed by Vestal Coffin, Enoch Macy, and George Swain, who successfully got him extradited back to Greensboro, where 3 years later, in 1820, Benjamin Benson won his freedom through the court system. One of the first such cases of a black person using the legal system to gain his freedom. Well, in 1819, there's another case that led directly to the first Underground Railroad activity here. And that was of another free black by the name of John Demery. John Demery was a free black living with his family in southern North Carolina, and aware that he was in danger of being kidnapped, moved with his family into the New Garden Quaker community here in Guilford County to have that extra layer of protection. And settling here by 1819, soon thereafter, word came that his previous owner had died. I'm not sure if John Demery was aware of this, but his previous owner's sons certainly were. And they decided they were going to reclaim their rightful property. And so they rode into the New Garden community one winter night in 1819, found out where the Demery cabin wasn't too far from the Quaker meeting house, and rode up to the front door and yelled out for assistance, claiming to have been out hunting and gotten lost. And John Demery steps out of his cabin door and is immediately jumped. They start tying him up with ropes. They're going to haul him off and sell him into slavery. Demery's wife comes running out to see what the commotion's about, and they knock her unconscious. The daughter comes running out to see what's happening, and before they can knock her out, John Demery yells to her, "Run, get Vestal Coffin." Vestal Coffin is a known entity. Helped found the Manumission Society. He was one of the three Quakers who had been instrumental in the Benjamin Benson case, known abolitionist whose farm, 170-acre farm, is very near the meeting house. If you're familiar with Greensboro, it's where the Kathleen Clay Edwards Library, Temple Emmanuel Synagogue, the Target Shopping Center is now along New Garden Road. The daughter runs through the night, finds Vestal Coffin having just stepped out of his cabin door to get a load of firewood. She tells him what the deal is. He drops the load of firewood, grabs a neighbor, runs back in time to intercept these kidnappers. And Vestal Coffin lets them know he knows what's up. He knows the law. He's done this before, and they're in trouble. And the kidnappers are a little spooked by this, don't know quite how to respond. In the meantime, while they're trying to figure out what to do next, the neighbor that Vestal Coffin had grabbed unties John Demery's ropes, and Demery springs to freedom into the night. The kidnappers are spooked, hop back on their horses, hightail it out of there. Later on that night, Demery comes back to the Coffin cabin, and they know that the kidnappers will be back, and he needs to get out of there. And that night in 1819, Vestal and Alethea Coffin map out his route to Richmond, Indiana, a town founded just a decade before by three Quakers out of Randolph County, North Carolina, the Back Creek meeting, Jeremiah Cox, John Smith, and David Hoover, an ancestor of Herbert Hoover. And 6 weeks later, by foot, up over the Blue Ridge Mountains through southern Virginia to Charleston, along the Kanawha River to the Ohio, along the Ohio to Cincinnati, and up, still called the Quaker Trace, through southwestern Ohio to Richmond, Indiana, where Demery arrives safely, lives and works for 2 years, earning enough money to send for his family, who join him later. So that night in 1819, we have the first known passenger, the first known conductors on what became known as the Underground Railroad here in Guilford County. Vestal Coffin continues to do this work with his first cousin, Levi Coffin, until Vestal Coffin dies in 1826, leaving his farm and 4 daughters to Alethea. There's an amazing story there that Addison Coffin talks about in his book, Travels. And Levi Coffin packs up his family in 1826 and moves to Indiana, where his and Catherine's home just north of Richmond, and then Newport, now Fountain City, becomes known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad in that part of the route. Between 2,000 and 3,000 fugitives from slavery went through their home on their way to freedom. I want to say a little bit about Coffin's origins here. He's much better known for his work up in Indiana and later on in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he was a friend of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and he and Catherine show up as the Quaker couple in Uncle Tom's Cabin. But as a boy here in the New Garden community, Levi Coffin was introduced to the evils of slavery as he saw coffles, groups of slaves being herded up the New Salisbury Road to slave markets in Virginia. He found enslaved persons hiding out in the New Garden woods when he went back to feed the hogs, and found these fugitives from slavery digging primitive caves in the embankment of the Horsepin Creek and building debris huts to stay in, just because they had to get away from whatever the situation was where they were enslaved, and began taking them food and hearing their stories. All of this is related in his autobiography, Reminiscences of Levi Coffin, which is still available. Ben Richmond, formerly of Friends United Meeting, has done a new edition of Levi Coffin's Reminiscences. Later on, as a young boy, has a famous encounter with probably the most famous and influential person of North Carolina at the time, David Caldwell, about Caldwell's attempt to send an enslaved woman that they owned off to Charlotte to be domestic help with their son and his new wife. And Coffin confronts him about this 12-year-old farm boy with minimal education confronting David Caldwell, Princeton graduate, founder of the first college in North Carolina, had been offered the first presidency of the University of North Carolina, great Presbyterian preacher, and convinces the Caldwells not to do it. It's just an amazing case of speaking truth to power. When Coffin and his family eventually get to Indiana, there are all kinds of interesting stories about him up there. I want to relate just a few to give some sense of all the balls you had to keep in the air if you were a Quaker involved in the Underground Railroad. You've got this testimony of equality. You've got this testimony of integrity. You've got this testimony against violence. And how do you keep all those balls in the air? Well, one of my favorite stories is probably apocryphal, but it's too good not to be true. One day, Coffin was supposedly transporting 2 passengers in a false bottom wagon. You probably know the history of the false bottom wagons. There's one here at the Mendenhall Home Place in Jamestown. There's one at the Coffin Museum in Fountain City. Specially built wagons with a false bottom, little compartment under the cargo bay where you could hide passengers and folk wouldn't suspect what you were doing. And on this occasion, Coffin had a load of clay pots and 2 passengers in this secret compartment and was stopped on the road by a slave chaser who didn't have the proper papers to search the wagon, but knew the Quaker had to be honest. If you asked him a direct question, that testimony of integrity would kick in and Coffin would have to answer honestly. So the question was, he should have phrased it differently, but the question was, all right, Coffin, I know what you're up to. What are you really carrying in that wagon? And Coffin looked back at his clay pots and said, earthen vessels. I'm just carrying earthen vessels, which clay pots are, like David Haynes's pottery behind him, but so are we, made of the dust of the earth. Now, again, may well be apocryphal, but there are all kinds of different stories about that kind of white lie. But you also had to know your law. And on one occasion that we do know is true, Coffin was hauled into court in Wayne County and you put up on the witness stand. He affirmed he would tell the truth, but they had captured one of the enslaved persons who'd been through the Coffin home and gone on further up north on the routes of the Underground Railroad and been captured and was brought into the court in Wayne County to be used as material witness to nab Levi Coffin for violating the fugitive slave law, which meant that even though Indiana was a free state, a fugitive could be captured there and hauled back to the South. So with Levi Coffin on the witness stand, the prosecutor points out this black person and says, Levi Coffin, do you recognize this black man? And Coffin said, yes, I recognize him. He says, is it not true that you recognize him because you and your wife gave refuge to him recently, knowingly violated the fugitive slave law? And Coffin said, well, I do recognize him because he came to our house looking for assistance. He was hungry. He was tired, came to our front door, and we offered him assistance as any good Christian would. And the prosecutor, pressed his case, but did you not know at the time that he was a fugitive from slavery and you were in violation of the law? And Coffin said, he did tell us that he was a fugitive from slavery. He gave us his testimony. But I have to remind this court of law that under the laws of the state of Indiana, the testimony of a black person is not admissible in a court of law. So they had dismissed the case. So there are all kinds of stories like that. I don't have time to go into all of them. Some involve my great-great-grandparents, Robert Cook and Elizabeth Johnson, who were conductors. If you've read Alan Jay's autobiography, you know the case of when he was a little boy and his parents let him know how to take care of a fugitive who was going to come to their home without letting them know, so that if any slave chasers came to figure out what was going on, they wouldn't ask the little boy with a hair lip and a cleft palate, who knew what was up. They asked the parents who had set things up so that they never knew what Alan was doing to give refuge to this enslaved person. Look up, there's a children's story called Alan Jay and the Underground Railroad. That's available for a children's story based on his autobiography, or you can read Joshua Brown's edition of Alan Jay's autobiography. Some other books that give insight into the history of the Underground Railroad and anti-slavery in North Carolina: Stephen B. Weeks' Southern Quakers and Slavery, the classic work by an historian who's raised in Perquimans County in the Quaker community of Nixonton. Yep, Richard Nixon's ancestors came out of there, who went on to be a professor of history at UNC. And Hiram Hilty, the late professor at Guilford College, whose dissertation at UNC was later made into a book, By Land and by Sea. Now, Rousey, I don't know if that was done by the Yearly Meeting Publication Committee.
Believe that was a joint publication between North Carolina Yearly Meeting and the Friends Historical Society. And yes, I was on the board at that time.
Yeah, Rousey knows all. Well, anyway, that's a little bit of the history of Southern Friends and slavery. Let me throw the floor open to your comments, questions, additions, corrections in the time we have remaining. I will say that next week we'll talk about the impact of this on the Southern Quaker community. If you're anti-slavery and you're involved in illegal activity, not only the Underground Railroad, but Levi Coffin and others were educating blacks in a little Sabbath school at New Garden in 1821 to teach them literacy under the guise of teaching them how to read the Bible, which is against the law. Eventually you had to get out of here. So we went from some 20,000 Quakers in the South to fewer than 2,000 by the end of the Civil War. And we'll talk about that next week. But yeah, questions, comments, additions? Well, let me mention very quickly the story of Edith Mackey, who I think Kay Coltrane and Rousey Hobson probably knew. She died 12 years ago at the age of 104 here at Friends' Homes in Greensboro. Her grandparents were conductors on the Underground Railroad as a young couple up in western Indiana, Park County. In 1850, an incident happened that Edith heard directly from her grandmother and related to many of us. One night, her grandparents were in bed, and there was a knock on the door, and it was the Underground Railroad knock. 3 loud bangs, long pause, 2 loud bangs. And you knew it was fugitives, and it wasn't slave chasers. You had to know. And they jumped out of bed, opened the door, and there was a group of fugitives from slavery, including a young woman, visibly pregnant, who gave birth that night in the bed they just hopped out of to a little girl they named Annie. Well, they stayed in the home for about 24 hours to rest, get food, but they had to get to Canada. You had to get to Canada because of fugitive slave law. With a newborn, they couldn't make much progress, so they asked Edith's grandparents, would you keep this child until we get to Canada? Trail grows cold, we're safe, we'll come back and get Annie. And they said, well, sure. Off they go, and they never came back. So Edith, whom many of us knew, grew up with a black aunt born in slavery because her grandparents raised that child until she was 16 when she said, I want to go find my birth family. So they gave her a train ticket, provisions. Off goes Annie to Canada, finds her birth father, learns that her mother had died on the way to Canada. He had remarried, had a family. She stayed with him the rest of her life, but maintained that contact. It's just a remarkable story of, again, some insight into the secret language, the oral traditions of the Underground Railroad, because you couldn't write this stuff down. It was illegal, the secret knock. And someone that we have known, who had that direct link to slavery. It just wasn't that long ago. But anyway. So I bought time for some questions. Okay, then my great-great-grandparents, they were conductors in Clinton County, Indiana, just south of where I was raised. And one night, just after supper, Grandma was upstairs with their own small children and a group of enslaved persons who were on their way. And Grandpa was downstairs in the parlor. There's a knock on the door, and it was not the 3 loud bangs, long pause, and 2 loud bangs. These were slave chasers, and they had papers, and they could search the house. And Grandpa welcomes them in and says, well, of course, you can search the house. But right now, my wife's putting children to bed upstairs, and you might disturb them if you search now. But if you'll wait here in a moment while my wife puts children to bed upstairs, you can search the house. Well, Grandma hears it, knows what's up, gets the enslaved persons together, gives them instructions on where to go next. Uncle Jimmy Stanley's house, the next station, sees them out through the 2nd floor window on the back porch roof. They shimmy down the posts, through the barnyard, through the pasture, to the woods in safety. When she knows they're safe, she then tucks the children in, calls down, dear, our children are in bed now. We may send our guests up. And they didn't find anyone. Now, I heard that story directly from my Aunt Tot, who heard it directly from Robert and Elizabeth. It's probably been embellished a bit over the years, but again, it gives you a sense of how you keep those balls in the air to try to give equal weight to all those testimonies. Okay, Rousey, I saw your hand up. Nope.
Holly
Any other?
Stevens.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Polly, and I was wondering if there's any way you could do a bibliography of these different books that you mentioned. They sound so fascinating. Maybe an annotated bibliography.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, well-
Kathleen on it.
I'm
Holly,
sorry.
we'll- some of those, sorry, my connection's breaking up a little bit. Holly, we will send some of those out because Max has sent me a list of those books.
I can't make out what she said. What?
Yes, Kathleen will send that out. I've sent her a list of some of these books,
Oh.
and she will be in touch with folk about them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Now, of course, you folk up there in New England know all about John Greenleaf Whittier and his involvement in all of this anti-slavery stuff. But Kathleen, I'm sure, will do her own presentation on John Greenleaf Whittier at some point. One of my favorite of his poems relates to the Southern economic culture, and it's the there's the brewing of soma, of course, which is wonderful. It equates all these hallucinogenic beverages to the impact of cotton on those who supported the slave trade. Yeah. Okay. No other questions? I know we're at the end of our hour.
This has been great, Max. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kathleen and Mill City Quakers.
Okay.
And thank
Well,
you all for listening in.
Yep. We'll see. We've got 2 more weeks to go. So we will see some of you next week.
Yep. Now, next week, again, we're going to talk about the Great Migration of Quakers out of the South because of slavery and economics. Deep loam beckoned Quaker farmers out of the red clay of North Carolina. But primarily, as Stephen B. Weeks says, it was slavery. And we'll talk about why, if you drive through central Indiana on National Road, US 40 or I-70, you think you're driving through North Carolina, through Wayne County, Henry County, Randolph County, Greensboro, Plainfield. And if you pick up what was formerly known as phone books, you look at surnames like Mendenhall, Newby, Osborne, Winslow, and why James Dean, the actor, in one of his famous pictures, is standing next to the prize Yorkshire State Fair winning hog of his aunt and uncle Winslow's.
Mm. Thank you. This is just wonderful to hear you.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Max.
Well, thank you all. We'll see you next week.
Okay.
Bye-bye.